You might remember the airplane from the Madagascar series. It's in all 3 main movies, it's one of the main locations of all Hail King Julien, and before it was repaired, there were 2 dead bodies in the plane. I am 100% sure that I found out who they were, the exact model of the plane, and even the date they crashed on Madagascar. To find out, let's first look at everything notable about the plane itself. The plane is made of some metallic grey material. It has a rounded nose and 2 large wings. The wings are very thick and round and much thicker towards the front of the plane. Each wing has 1 engine, and while one of them is damaged, the other one is still intact, and we can see that it has 3 blades and is connected to a part of the turbine that is screwed together by large bolts. The cockpit windshield is made up of 6 separate windshields, 2 big ones in the front, a tiny one next to each of them, and a medium-sized one next to each of those. Another notable thing is the ring on the roof of the plane. I honestly don't really know what its purpose is, so if you know better, let me know in the comments. There's 2 things written onto the plane as well. Under the cockpit window, there's a round logo showing the island of Madagascar and the words Visiter Madagascar en avion, which is French for visit Madagascar by plane. Visiter in this spelling is the second person plural conjugated form of visiter, so it's meant as something along the lines of you can visit Madagascar by plane. The other text says Le Tour de Madagascar, which means something like Madagascar tour or the tour of Madagascar. Basically, it just means that they are flying to Madagascar. There's not a lot of notable things to say about the inside of the plane, but in the second movie we briefly see Marty reading a Life magazine, so I went through an online archive of Life magazine and actually found the issue that Marty is reading here. It is the Life magazine issue from May 1st, 1939. On the cover you can see Joe DiMaggio,
American hero maker,
one of the most well-known players of the New York Yankees. I did skim through the issue, but didn't find anything that's important to us now, though this does help us understand approximately when the plane must have landed here. So what do we know about the bodies? Actually, there is a huge detail that narrows it down to a very small amount of people. Because on multiple occasions we learn that the actual pilot was a woman. Alright, great, so let's go to our browser of choice, type in first female pilot to fly across the world, and Jerry Mock. Alright, that has to be her then. Well, no, her plane doesn't match at all. Well, maybe it's Joan Marion Smith. It says here that the 2 held a race to see who would be the first woman to fly across the world alone, and that Smith followed the flight path of Amelia Earhart's last flight? Who's Amelia? So, as many people have already suspected, the pilot seems to be Amelia Earhart. And while I agree with that, I have another theory, as well as some new discoveries. I will now present all the evidence to you, and at first I will explain what the common theory on this is. Julien actually calls the pilot's skeleton Amelia in Merry Madagascar, but this alone would not be enough to prove it is her. While Julien calling her by that name is most likely a reference to Earhart made by the writers, we can't know for sure that it's her. Julien knowing the identity of the pilot is no more likely than him just knowing Amelia Earhart's name as a famous aviator. Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, famously disappeared on their attempt to fly around the Earth when all that was left to be traversed was the Pacific Ocean. Their bodies were never found, which is why in the fictional world of the Madagascar franchise, where Madagascar is not inhabited by humans, a possible explanation would be that they landed on Madagascar and therefore were never found. The plane, a Lockheed Model 10 Electra, also very closely matches the plane we see in Madagascar, as I described it previously. And if you look at them from the front side by side, they actually look almost identical. So the 2 dead bodies seem to be Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, right? Right, just don't look at the remaining runtime of the video. Leave a like, subscribe, click off, and go on with your day. Too bad I didn't discover anything else that overcomplicates everything. Yeah, I lied to you. Sure, the pilot is most likely supposed to be Amelia Earhart, but a lot doesn't quite make sense here. First of all, in the second movie we can briefly see a third skeleton in the airplane. There's a skeleton without a skull sitting in the seat behind Alex, wearing brown leather shoes, short blue pants and a green Aloha shirt with pineapples and fish depicted on it. And this is not Fred Noonan, we see him in the front of the plane. So could this be Amelia Earhart? Well, we actually don't see her in this movie, but I would argue this is not her. The skeleton is missing its head, and I'd argue that if it didn't fall off for roughly 69 years, after changing positions multiple times, and presumably after going through a very one-sided romantic relationship with Julien, it should not just randomly fall off now. And even if it did, it should not be too difficult to put the skull back onto the rest of the otherwise fully intact body. Also, just in this scene, we see Noonan's skeleton fall out of the plane, being pulled out of it head first, and even then it is still in one piece. I would argue it is more plausible to assume that this is a third skeleton, which also explains the entirely different clothes. Clothes which, to me, don't look like what a woman in the 1930s would wear in public or even be allowed to wear. The missing skull in this case would then be explained by the passenger losing their head during the crash. And while Merry Madagascar is of questionable canonicity for sure, it is the piece of Madagascar media that chronologically plays right before Madagascar 2, and in Merry Madagascar we learn that Julien has romantic feelings towards Amelia and maybe even thinks they are in a relationship. I don't see why he wouldn't care about her losing her head and then move her to a different spot within the plane. If he kept her in the plane, she would for sure still be sitting in the cockpit, or at least in first class, where Julien and Maurice and the dead body of Fred Noonan sit during the flight. So we are going to assume that maybe because of Julien's love for her, Earhart's skeleton was moved out of the plane, as the penguins would be the new pilots from now on. Unfortunately, that doesn't solve the main question right now. Why is there a third body? Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were the only ones in the plane, but here we see at least one more passenger. This brings us to something people just tend to disregard when theorizing about this. I have actually mentioned it in detail in this very video, so comment now if you can guess what it is. Well, the thing in question is of course the writing on the plane. Visit Madagascar by plane? The Madagascar tour? That does not sound like they are trying to fly around the world. And now remember the magazine I told you about earlier. Life magazine from May 1st, 1939. The one with Joe DiMaggio.
American hero maker.
On the cover. Earhart and Noonan disappeared July 2nd, 1937 and were declared dead on January 5th, 1939 and June 20th, 1938, respectively. The Life magazine Marty finds and reads in the plane was published after the disappearance and after both of them were declared dead. So how could it possibly be in the airplane? Following this logic, the plane has to have had at least one stop since May 1st, 1939, which is impossible. Does this mean it's not Amelia Earhart and not Fred Noonan either? The real Earhart didn't go to Madagascar, and they can't have picked up the Life magazine 2 years before its release. Also, there was no third passenger. Well, I have a different take on this. Because, believe it or not, this is close to what almost actually could have happened in 1937. In 1937, the first attempt for their flight around the globe was rescheduled from March 16th to March 17th. On March 17th, they crashed. The attempt was rescheduled again to March 20th. But on March 20th, the plane crashed during takeoff, destroying landing gear and damaging other parts. This is why they rescheduled it again, and in the meantime, Harry Manning had left the crew, which is why only Earhart and Noonan were left. If any of this didn't happen, especially if the crash before the final attempt didn't happen, maybe the 3-person crew could have actually made it. Remember, in the Madagascar world, humans don't live on Madagascar, so a legendary aviator like Earhart, who would have been the first woman to fly around the globe, might be someone who would risk flying to Madagascar to explore the island. And let's be real, the body is being called Amelia. The plane is, except for a detail I'll get into in just a minute, an almost exact match to Earhart's Electra. The magazine roughly dates the crashed flight at a time where Amelia Earhart would be one of very few active female aviators. This is an intentional reference. And on top of that, the male skeleton is never mentioned by name. So if you're doubting that Noonan would keep flying on expeditions with Earhart, yeah, it's probably not him. Hey, I'm editing the video right now and I actually forgot about another detail. In the first movie we actually see the second pilot hanging from the trees. So there's actually 4 bodies, which doesn't really change my own theory, but it just further disproves the existing theory, right? Because now you can't even argue that there's 2 bodies and one of them changed clothes. In the first movie we see Amelia sitting in the cockpit and we see another pilot, that being Fred Noonan or whoever is the pilot or navigator now, hanging from the tree in front of the plane in one scene in the first movie. And then there's the body that I already told you could be Fred Noonan but doesn't have to be him. And then on top of that there's also the headless body. So even if you believe that the headless body is Amelia, then there's still at least 3 bodies. The 4 major changes would all be explained by this. First of all, this explains why they would be on Madagascar, while their route never went over the island. This is simply not the same flight as the one that killed Earhart and Noonan in the real world. Secondly, the writing on the plane. This simply is not a flight around the world. As it says on the side of the aircraft, it is the tour of Madagascar. And then there's the third body. I don't want to repeat myself the entire time, but this is not the same flight. There are more passengers. Visitez Madagascar en avion, as it says on the airplane. You can now visit Madagascar by plane. And change number 4, as I alluded to earlier, there is a change in the design. The engines have 3 blades each now. The actual plane only had 2 each. Now, what could this mean? It's quite simple. The plane has to safely carry at least approximately 14 passengers, plus 2 pilots and their luggage now. So it is basically just an upscaled version of the Lockheed Model 10 Electra and needs stronger engines. And there actually was such a plane. Shortly after Earhart's disappearance, the Lockheed Model 14 Super Electra was released. It is essentially a bigger Electra, and most importantly, the engines have 3 blades each and the plane has 14 passenger seats, just like what we see in Madagascar. That's why I think in the Madagascar universe, Amelia Earhart most likely managed to be the first woman to fly around the Earth. Her and Fred Noonan survived, and later, at some point after May 1st, 1939, they went on an expedition to Madagascar and crashed into the tallest baobab tree in the middle of the Julien family's kingdom. Let me know if you have any thoughts on this topic. Just be respectful as we are talking about real people, and please feel free to ask me any questions you may have in the comments below. Otherwise, like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot and makes it easier for you and anyone else to find my videos, and thanks for watching.